Welcome to Silmarillion chat number 7, where I'm going through the Silmarillion with the sort of gobbets that I've been reading with a group of friends and just talking about what's going on in them and some of my thoughts and some of the connections. And the 3 chapters this time, so this is spoiler discussion. Chapter 16 of Maeglin, 17 of the coming of men into the west, and 18 of the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. So you can tell things are about to go very wrong, or begin to go wrong in this set of chapters. The first, I think I was working out, if you go from the Gondolin Dale through to the Darkening of Valinor, chapter 8 of the Quenta Silmarillion, this is a section where they're mostly in Valinor. It has bad stuff happening all the time, including the Darkening of Valinor, but it's a it's much more prehistorical myth rather than saga legend, which much of the rest is. There's the beginnings of saga legend throughout this section, as the elves become more and more important and stuff around Fëanor, but it transitions from being mostly about the archangels or gods or whatever you want to see the Valar as, through to being mostly about, by chapter 3 or something, increasingly mostly about the elves. And in this section, you then have a section where they come to increasing action. They come to Beleriand. There's lots of fighting. They settle things. You get a lot about their politics, a lot about their friendships, a lot about the time of peace. And so it's not low action, but and you have great adventures like Fingon rescuing Maethros, for instance, which I think I would have spoken about last time. But now you get this big step up where essentially there is no longer time to think, this is how they politically organise. This is the way that Finrod and Turgon build their secret cities of Nargothrond and Gondolin. Instead, now it's just all action all the time. It does start, though, in chapter 16 of Maeglin with something a little different. And in our group, I don't think people felt they preferred of Maeglin, but I think several people thought they found it easier to get hold of because it has a limited cast, and I'll touch on that in a second. In a wider context, it had a limited cast and a kind of very driven plot and a very set of storytelling objectives. It's a single story, and basically what happens in Of Maeglin is that Turgon is king of the hidden city of Gondolin, and he is the younger brother of Fingon, the youngest son of Fingolfin, the High King. And he, along with his cousin Finrod, have founded hidden cities and fortresses for when things go wrong as refuges. And Turgon has been inspired not by Menegroth, the grey elf fortress cave system in the beautiful forest of Doriath, which is what Finrod is inspired by, but instead by the city that they used to live in Valinor, this beautiful city on a hill, and he's got this hidden city in a vale. And this is what happens is his sister Arathel Arfiniel, the White Lady of the Noldor, dwelt in Nevrast with Turgon, her brother, and she went with him to the Hidden Kingdom. This is the problem, essentially, because she wearies of the guarded city of Gondolin, desiring ever the longer to ride to ride again in the wide lands and to walk in the forests. And eventually, Turgon says, "You can go. It's fine. You can." He yields. He doesn't want to trap her. No one's really allowed to leave. But this is her sister. His sister. This is royalty. And he says, "Okay, go and seek our brother Fingon, and those I send with you shall return hither to Gondolin as swiftly as they may." So essentially, we will reduce the intelligence risk by you just go straight to someone we trust. You're guarded, and then other people who might know where we live come straight back. And Arthur basically refuses to, gets quite angry at this. "I'm your sister, not your servant. Beyond your bounds I'll go as seems good to me, and if you grudge me an escort, then I'll go alone." And Turgon says, "I grudge you nothing I have, yet I desire that none shall dwell beyond my walls who know the way hither. And if I trust you, my sister, others I trust less to keep guard on their tongues." And so he appoints 3 lords of his household to go with her. Be wary, for though Morgoth be yet hemmed in the north, there are many perils in Middle-earth for which the lady knows nothing. And Turgon is very heavy at this, and she eventually orders the guards off, her escort off, and says, "I'm going to go to the Sons of Fëanor." And she wants to go and see her old friends rather than having to go to see her brother. It's interesting that there is a friendship with the Sons of Fëanor, much like Maethros and Fingon are friends, evidently Arathel too. There's not really the same sense that Turgon was either third of those children of Fingolfin, and Fingolfin certainly obviously had very significant tensions already with Fëanor. But yes, Fingon and Arathel at least have close friendships with their cousins, and that's come up as a reason for why they want to go with them in part. And Arathel and the guard try to turn towards Fëanor's lands, or the sons of Fëanor's lands. They are refused by the Marchwalls of Doriath because this grudge, this problem over learning about the kinslaying. King Thingol has banned the sons of Fëanor. Indeed, he's banned the children of Fingolfin too. And you have to go to the south of the north, and the speediest way is to do this. And then if you do that, then you can get to where Celegorm and Quenta are at the Hill of Himring, and maybe you'll find them. Arathel says okay, and she's bold. She's very brave. She goes through the Ered Gorgoroth, which is infested by the children of Ungoliant. It's this dark, evil place, the Mountains of Terror. And then her companions lose her. She strays too far. They assume she's dead. So eventually, after a long search, they return to Gondolin, and Turgon sat long alone, enduring grief and anger in silence. But Arathel is fearless and hardy of heart, and she held on her way, and got to Himring, and I found out that Celegorm and Curufin were riding with Caranthir, their brother. But everyone's really pleased that she's arrived. The year lengthened. This is one thing. This trip, they have so much time in this time of peace that they're away for months. And Celegorm does not return. Celegorm obviously being her particular friend. And she takes to riding alone in the forest. And then she passes over Caelon. And before she was aware, she's enmeshed in Nan Elmoth, which is part of the kingdom of Doriath, but not within the girdle of Melian, this protective barrier which you can't pass without permission, basically. And now we meet a character who is, I think, one of the more interesting characters. He's only in this chapter, but one of the most interesting characters in the book, Eol, called the Dark Elf, and he lives alone in the forest, we're told. And here's the thing, this is not Tolkien misleading us, but it's something about a manner of speech. He's the Dark Elf who lives alone, but he is, we are told, a kinsman of Thingol, and we're later told he has servants, and these servants are presumably elves. They're grey or green elves. We're talking about a royal prince like Celeborn. He's described in the same way as Celeborn, the husband of Galadriel, is as a kinsman of Thingol, therefore a kinsman of Olwe, of Aqualonde in Valinor, or just off Valinor. So we're talking about someone who's quite powerful, quite rich. There's a weird thing about Eol, and this shows that the problems that are coming up are not only to do with the fall of the Noldor, the doom of the Noldor, but to do with just everyone's hearts. And in this case, Eol didn't want to stay in Doriath. He felt trapped. And Arathel comes there. He becomes a great friend of the dwarves. The Nalgrim, the dwarves from the Blue Mountains at Belagost and Nogrod, often come and they teach him things. He creates a metal called Galvorn, which is black and shining as jet, which is hard as steel, but malleable as well, supple. He was no dwarf. He's a tall elf of a high kin of the Teleri, noble though grim of face, and his eyes could see deep into shadows and dark places. And Arathel's straying amongst the trees of Nan Elmoth, a gleam of white in the dark land, dim land, and he set his enchantments out to draw her nearer and nearer. They then meet, and they do fall in love. She stays not unwillingly, at least at first. So there is something a bit creepy and weird about that, but it's not strictly a kidnap in the sense that once they meet and fall in love, she wants to be there, and it was very long ere any of her kin heard of her again. So you have these two people who hate being bounded, coming together, falling in love to some degree, though of course one does that by bounding the other in ways that she doesn't understand. It's actually quite a subtle, weird story, and it sets up what's going to happen with their son Maeglin. Pretty significantly sets up and parallels that. But Eol is not a trivial character. He's not just a freak out in the forest. He's a high kin. He has servants. He has great magic. He's a great smith. He's a powerful man. And they have a son called Eol, though she calls him, in the forbidden tongue of the Noldor, Lomion, child of the twilight. Then he called him Maeglin, which is sharp glance. Maeglin grows to full stature, and he's a lot like his father in mood and mind, and that's important. He's controlling, he's maybe a bit tormented inside, he hates being trapped. He looks like his mother, and he loves his mother the better, and she tells him all these things when Eorl is abroad, tells him all these things about the house of Fingolfin, Eldamar, and Turgon, and that Turgon has no heir because his wife Elenwe died in the crossing of the Elcaraxe, and his daughter Idril Celebrimbor was his only child, and so doesn't inherit, because here we're talking about a hereditary kingship where someone needs to be able to lead in action, and in this paradigm, in this culture, we're talking about men. And Arathel, telling her son these things, wants to see her family again, wants to see her kin. And she thinks, how did I ever grow bored of Gondolin? Arathel is also a complex character, because Arathel is not entirely attractive in terms of her behaviour. She is not simply a freedom-loving woman. I mean, you could read it like that, but I think much like you need to read Eorl as more than just some creepy psycho in the woods. He is a bit of that, but he's more. Arathel is a free-spirited and strong woman, like Galadriel. But Galadriel is happy in Doriath and can settle and find purpose. Arathel gets very frustrated and refuses to heed counsel and ends up getting herself into trouble, ends up in this crazy situation. And now, a lot later, thinks, I don't really want... yeah. I mean, and I think her behaviour, there's a few other instances where you think, her behaviour is not perfect here. I'm not saying she's the villain at all, but she is also she's an instigator of what's happening, and the fact that this is going to lead to disaster is apparent. She's an instigator of that too. That's why Turgon is uneasy. Yeah, I'd say Maeglin has come to know the dwarves very well as well, going with his father. But because these tales, Maeglin and Eorl start arguing, and but Arathel won't tell Maeglin where Turgon lives. But he bides his time, trusting it to read all the secret from her. But ere he could read her unguarded mind, he desired to look on the Noldor and speak with the sons of Feanor. But his father is furious, and this shows us that Eorl is of the house of Thingol. You're of the house of Eorl, Maeglin, my son, and not of the Golothrim. All this land is the land of the Telerian. I will not deal, nor have my son deal with the slayers of our kin, the invaders and usurpers of our homes. In this you shall obey me, or I will set you in bonds. And Maeglin did not answer, but was cold and silent. But essentially then, when Eorl is feasting with the dwarves at midsummer, which is a great feast time of theirs, we're talking about a guy who has allies and friends. Arathel and Maeglin make a break for it at Maeglin's suggestion. And Eorl returns sooner than expected and finds out they're gone. And he is careful because he knows that Celegorm and Curufin are dangerous. So when he goes to look for them there, in fact, we're told Celegorm and Curufin were mighty, and Curufin, moreover, was of perilous mood. Celegorm the bright, Caranthir the dark, Curufin the crafty, is it? I'm trying to remember, but we get these little details like how is it Angrod who completely loses it with the over the sons of Feanor and the kinslaying, and is the one who basically reveals half of that to Thingol. But yeah, Celegorm is perhaps more easygoing and is Arathel's close friend, but Curufin, perhaps more like Caranthir, is a bit dangerous and difficult. And his scouts know that Maeglin and Arathel have gone, and he comes out and he meets Eorl. What errand have you, dark elf, in my lands? An urgent matter, perhaps, that keeps one so sun-shy abroad by day. And Eorl is quite careful and makes sure not to offend him. And Curufin is basically quite rude to him. And Eorl even, sarcastically ends up, the only thing he says is, oh, it's so good to know that a kinsman, a cousin-in-law, is so kind. And Curufin is furious at this. You've stolen the daughters of the Noldor, wed them without gift or leave, and so you do not gain kinship with their kin. And Eorl rides off, hating the Noldor, and he understands now that his wife has not been coming to her cousin, her friend Celegorm, but fleeing back to her home, which he understands exists. He doesn't know where it is. So he comes, and follows them. Arathel and Maeglin arrive, and the king is really happy to have them back. Listens with wonder to Arathel. He looks with liking upon Maeglin, his sister son, seeing in him one worthy to be accounted among the princes of the Noldor. There's a problem here for Turgon, that Maeglin looks like a Noldor and speaks like a Noldor and has learnt the tales of the Noldor and is capable and brave. But we know, because the author's told us, he has a break in his character. The problems in the elves are not only in the Noldor. So there you have, and this is a point was made a few times, particularly by Lawrence in the reading group, there's an issue of original sin here. There's a parallel to original sin with the Noldor and the doom of the Noldor. But sin in that sense is much more expansive. There are people in Middle-earth sin, if we want to use that term, beyond the doom of the Noldor, and Eöl is a broken man. And his son Maeglin then has the same flaw in his character. Maeglin shall have the highest honour in my realm, and Maeglin is amazed by Gondolin, but he's most amazed by Idril Celebrimbor. She was golden as the Vanyar, her mother's kindred, and she seemed to him the sun from which all the King's Hall drew its light. Eöl, however, has found this place, and so remember, these places are meant to be hidden, and particularly Gondolin is meant to be hidden. Nargothrond is a kingdom, and people might not know the ways in and out of the of the central Menegroth-like palace and hidden fortress city. But the point is, Gondolin is actually hidden. It's called the Hidden City. No one knows where it is. Nargothrond is very secure, very safe, very hard to get into. But you can get into the wider kingdom. You know it's roughly where it is. Oh, it must be somewhere on the Narog. But no one knows where Turgon has even gone. There's rumours of something. But it's the hidden way to the hidden city that Eöl comes upon. And Arathel calls for mercy. He is Eöl. I'm his wife. He is the father of my son. Slay him not. And so it was done. And Eöl was brought to Turgon's hall and is amazed, but his heart is filled with hatred. Unlike Maeglin, who's like, this is amazing, Eöl thinks it's like, you've come, and Turgon says, you're really welcome. Love to have you here. You can't leave. That's the rule. But you are a guest of honour. And Eöl says, I acknowledge not your law. Turgon wants to shake his hand. Eöl pulls his hand away. No right have you nor any of your kin in this land to seize realms or to set bounds either here or there. This is the land of the Teleri, to which you bring war and all unquiet, dealing ever proudly and unjustly. I care nothing for your secrets, and I came not to spy upon you, but to claim my own, my wife and my son. Yet if in Arathel, your sister, you have some claim, then let her remain. Let the bird go back to the cage, where soon she will sicken again as she sickened before, but not so Maeglin. And says to Maeglin, he's got to come. Note that I think Eöl is probably right here about Arathel, that she will eventually, in 20 or 40 or 100 years, become bored again. There is a thing there where Arathel's impulsiveness has led to first her going somewhere in danger and causing grief to her brother and risk to her brother. When she voluntarily went, that's the point, she voluntarily went to Gondolin, and now she's come back and brought Eöl with her, and as well as Maeglin, and Maeglin and Eöl both have flaws in their hearts. Leave the house of our enemies and the slayers of our kin, or be accursed, he says to Maeglin. Eöl does. Maeglin doesn't answer, and Turgon is like, I'm not going to debate with you. By the swords of the Noldor alone are your sunless woods defended. Your freedom to wander there wild you owe to my kin, but for them long since you would have laboured in thraldom in the pits of Angband. Here I'm king, whether you will it or not, my doom is law. The choice only is given to you, to abide here or to die here, and so also for your son. These are both reasonable arguments. I think it's an interesting point. I do think it's genuinely a thing that we are meant to understand both and not think the Noldor are right, it's just their swords that defend the Grey Elves, or that the Sindar are right and it's just these bunch of kinslaying thieves. They both have strong arguments. The problem is that is not good enough. I think one observation in the discussion was this sort of constant argument amongst kin, amongst the elves, both amongst Feanor and Feanor's house and the other parts of the Noldor, but also between the Noldor and the Teleri. All of this is a real sort of problem that is maybe made better by the siege of Angband and the fight against Morgoth, ironically, because Morgoth is such a focus they have to ally. But here, and the Noldor accept the risks of defending the rest of Beleriand, hence where their pride comes, to be fair. But it's something where they are not wrong that Western Beleriand was under the control, basically, apart from the havens, of the armies of Morgoth. After the first battle, where Thingol manages to defeat one great army in the east, albeit a great loss, especially to the Green Elves, but in the west, they mostly conquer and besiege. And it takes the Noldor to clear them out, and the fact that there is such peace and happiness is because of the Noldor, and it's what relates partly to the Noldor also coming into rulership everywhere they come, of the Grey Elves. Many Grey Elves merge into these kingdoms, is the point, and the Noldor are because they've seen Valinor, much like Thingol, who has seen Valinor. That's why he is special and unique amongst the Sindar. He's really a true Teleri of Valinor rather than a Grey Elf, but because they have this infusion of glory, if you like, there's an explicit, I think, with the Light of Valinor as an explicit reference, and someone else made this in a comment in the chat, a explicit reference to Moses and the biblical stories of Moses glowing with the glory of God, and it impresses people. It's a power that goes into the person who's been there. And I guess you could say it's like education or wisdom, or like being close to good, decent people who teach you. But in this case, they're actually gods. Eol basically then throws a spear to kill Maeglin, because he's like, I'm not leaving my son here with you. It kills Arathel, and though Arathel and Idril originally moved Turgon to mercy, Arathel sickens and dies because the spear was poisoned. I don't know why, it's never made clear. Very strange, really. I don't think it's ever commented on why it's poisoned. Turgon then throws Eol off the cliff, the Carreg Dur, and Maeglin stands and says nothing, and Eol says, so you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son. Here shall you fail of all your hopes, and here may you die the same death as I. And then we see Maeglin achieves a lot of honour, and he's very wise. Wise in counsel was Maeglin, and wary, and yet hardy and valiant at need. And we hear the future disasters coming, and yet that was seen in the days, in after days. For when in the dread year of the Nerneath Arnodiad, Turgon opened his leaguer and marched forth to the help of Fingon in the north, Maeglin would not remain in Gondolin as regent to the king, but went to war and fought beside Turgon and proved fell and fearless in battle. Maeglin is a great warrior. He truly is an elf, and a high elf. He is the great grandson of Finwë. Truly, but though it seems well within a rot, a canker sets in his heart that he falls in love with his cousin, and basically the Noldor do not marry so close. They wed not with kin as near, nor ever before had any desire to do so. So though Tolkien doesn't say first cousins marrying is always immoral, the point made here is it is simply culturally alien and perverse in the sense it's never been done before. And so though we are perhaps left with a wiggle of room to say, well, some cultures do that, here it's not done and it's wrong, and the proof it's wrong, at least for the Eldar, is that he begins to just feel bitter and strange. It's not something he can get over. It is a tainted love. Thus it was in Gondolin, and amid all the bliss of that realm, whilst its glory lasted, a dark seed of evil was sown. We then come to the coming of men into the west. And this is and this actually probably requires a bit less attention for now, because there are lots of names here, but basically there are three kindred of men who come first into the west. There's the house of Beor the Old, there's the house of Marak, and there's the house of Haleth. And Haleth is is she the sister of the chief? Haldad had twin children, Haleth and Haldar. Haldad was slain and Haldar came out to help, and he was killed too, and so Haleth takes over and is one of the strong women of Lord of the Rings and the world of Middle-earth. It's really important to note that the way strong femininity is presented in Tolkien is not what we usually think of as strong femininity. Understandably, that's something people don't like necessarily, but unless we parse it, we'll get confused about what he's presenting. For instance, the point is that Eowyn is terribly courageous, terribly good, but it is better not that she goes out fighting as a shield maiden, though that is a category that exists in Rohirrim history, but that she marries Faramir. Galadriel is the most powerful non-angel in Middle Earth, pretty much. One could probably conclude, but she is also very comfortable with both being a powerful lord of the Noldor almost, but also a wife, mother, and within a bounded circle, a domus, and Haleth is pushed into this role, and we see, we have all kinds of parallels of that with very bold, brave women in the Silmarillion. Actually, there's far more in the Silmarillion, really, and we've met Galadriel and Arathel, and we've met the wisdom and power of Melian, who is one of them, equal with Sauron, say, to level of power equivalent, in fact, perhaps more so. But Haleth is a very brave woman and a very decent woman, but she's also very proud. So when we're looking at her, we're not looking at this is the original human girl boss. We're looking at a flawed person who is shaped by grief, forced by grief into a role that is not innate in terms of the traditions of her people. And it's interesting, Caranthir looks kindly upon these men, upon the Haladin, as they are being attacked and chased, because they're all migrating, but they're in vulnerable places. And Caranthir wants to help her, but she's proud and unwilling to be guided or ruled, and most of the Haladin were of like mood, so it's not just her, it's all these people. Therefore she thanked Caranthir, but said, "My mind is now set, Lord, to leave the shadow of the mountains and go west whither others of our kin have gone." And they go, they set themselves apart in the forest of Brethiel, not within the girdle of Melian. And the Haleth have the most interesting story on the whole. There's little stories about all of them. But you also hear that there's an interesting thing. I'll get back to the House of Beor actually, because there's an interesting story there. But the House of Haleth, though they are not necessarily the most important house in terms of patrilineal descent, if you want to go that way, they get some of the most detail as they move west and they have to fight their way through, and they settle themselves in Brethiel, and then they Hador Lorindol, son of Hathol, son of Maegor, son of Malak, Aradan enters. So that's another house. But the Haleth become friends essentially with the Sindar and settle in their land. You then have the House of I think it's Marak. Is it? Is Malak Aradan the House of Malak, or is that the House of Beor? I'm going to have to check. This is one thing. The names, I'm okay with the names through practice, generally speaking, and through reading it a lot, but with humans particularly it becomes challenging. And an interesting observation Parameter made was that this was almost like, all these names was almost like being mother and grandmother reading the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in childhood, and you have to learn the names by listening to them in this oral tradition. And very much the Silmarillion, apart from of the Maeglin chapter, that was a point people were making, the Silmarillion is often like that it works as an oral saga rather than as a this is just an interesting novel with some characters I'm following. There's all these people. But yeah, the House of Marak is the which is important because there's the patrilineal descent of Galdor and Hurin and Huor. They become they join the House of Fingolfin in Dor Lomin, and they become the mightiest of the chiefs of the Edain. And the House of Beor ends up. Where does the House of Beor? The House of Beor ends up as well in Dorthonion, so in the Highlands, in the centre south of Angband. But yeah, you've got these people, and there's the early heroes. You do get the idea that Morgoth is trying to tempt them away, and basically tries to trick. Well, he gets Bereg and Amlak, who are Bereg is of the House of Beor, Amlak is a grandson of Marak, and these houses have become close already. And he's tricked them into thinking that Valinor isn't real, and the gods basically aren't real, or if they are, they're bad. And he comes in fact, it's an interesting one, that someone, maybe Sauron or someone, oversteps the mark, and they're arguing, we take long roads and we don't want to serve the Eldar, and we don't want to go for this fake dream. And then the elf friends say, you've got to listen, only by the valor of the elves is Morgoth restrained. And Bereg's like, well, who cares? And there arose one who seemed to all to be Amlak, son of Imlak, He makes an argument that it's all a lie. There is no light in the west. You follow a full fire of the elves to the end of the world. Which of you has seen the least of the gods? Who has beheld the dark king of the north? Even Morgoth you don't really know about. And people are astounded and they become fearful. But Amlach returns and says that's a lie, I didn't say that. And repents of his previous rebellion, in terms of not being grateful to the elves. This is the story of the elves, and the elves are the heroes ultimately, and they are the good guys. And it's an interesting thing here that some are still convinced by Amlach's words. Are like, well, if he hates us so much, but maybe we better not screw around with him. And they go south and leave the story. They return back over the mountains. But I think Bereg and possibly his people also don't repent. They chose Bereg led 1,000 of the people of Beor southward. They pass out the songs, and the people of Marak, who still want to do that, do the same. They are forgotten. And that's an interesting thing of Doom, isn't it? That they are dismissed from the story because of a foolishness. We then get to the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. It's the first time also that we've heard of men being awakened, and now we've heard of them travelling into the west and joining the them. There's the House of Beor serves particularly Finrod Felagund. He does, but his people to end up with Finrod's brothers in Dorthonion. But yeah, you get to this point where men step into both as junior heroes under the elves. You hear of disaster. You hear of this great tragedy facing Fingolfin. The fall of Fingolfin makes it sound pretty bad, doesn't it? It's not like a trivial problem. So we know it's bad. We know it's going to be very sad, the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. And this is not the lowest point. It's not a spoiler really to say that, because we know everything the Noldor put their hand to is going to go wrong. And here we have the first great blow of disaster. You have, I guess, you have Angrod. You've had some deaths already of Feanor, particularly. I'm thinking of he died in the Dagor Bragollach. We've already had the fact that that Morgoth can cause great harm. Arathel has died for a different reason, because Eöl slays him, and Finwë has been killed in Valinor. But now we have a much wider political collapse, into a state of permanent war, we're told. Fingolfin, High King of the North, High King of the Noldor, seeing that his people would become numerous and strong, and that the men allied to them were many and valiant, pondered once more an assault upon Angband, for he knew they lived in danger while the circle of the siege was incomplete. The counsel was wise according to the measure of his knowledge, for the Noldor did not yet comprehend the fullness of the power of Morgoth, nor understand that their unaided war against him was without final hope, whether they hasted or delayed. But because the land was fair and the kingdoms wide, most of the Noldor were content with things as they were. Therefore they were little disposed to hearken to Fingolfin and the sons of Feanor at that time least of all. Among the chieftains of the Noldor, Angrod and Egnor alone were of like mind with the king, for they dwelt in regions whence Thangorodrim could be descried, and the threat of Morgoth was present to their thought. When the sixth generation of men after Beor and Marak, so you're talking, over 100 years later, were not yet come to full manhood, after the previous chapter where Beor and Marak and Haldad come in to the land, it being more than 400 years and 55 since the coming of Fingolfin, so we've had 455 years since the Dagor Bragollach and the general settlement of Beleriand, and yet more dire and sudden than his darkest fear, the evil befalls them. But on his part, he esteemed this is more so. Fingolfin doesn't realise how bad things are. It's said, however, that Morgoth's hate overcame his counsel, so if he had but endured to wait longer, until his designs were full, then the Noldor would have perished utterly. But on his part, he esteemed too lightly the valour of the elves and of men he took yet no account. So Morgoth bites too early. His own wicked genius is frustrated by his foolishness and his pride. And it's winter, and suddenly great rivers of flame run down swifter than Balrogs from Thangorodrim and poured all over the plain. The mountains of iron belch forth fire. Then Ardgallan, the big field, perishes in front of Thangorodrim. Fire devoured its grasses, and it was ever after full of choking dust, barren and lifeless. His name becomes the Gasping Dust. And many Noldor die. The heights of Dorthonion to the south and Eredwethren to the west hold back the fiery torrents, but the woods are burned. Thus began the fourth of the great battles, which are really campaigns, often implicitly months or years long. Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. In the front of that fire came Glowring the Golden, father of dragons in his full might, and in his train, remember he has come out once before, and in his train were Balrogs, behind them black armies of orcs. They assaulted the fortresses of the Noldor, broke the leaguer about Angband, and slew wherever they found them the Noldor and their allies, grey elves and men. Many of the stoutest of the foes of Morgoth were destroyed, because they're the ones at the siege. War ceased not wholly ever again in Beleriand, but the Battle of Sudden Flame is held to have ended with the coming of spring, when the onslaught of Morgoth grew less. So it's a couple of months at least in this case. Thus ended the siege of Angband. And real disaster has struck here. You know, Morgoth that has scattered and sundered his foes. Most of the Grey Elves flee south, and they never take part in the Northern War again. They go to Doriath, or they go to Nargothrond, or they go to the Falas, to the havens on the sea, or even to Assyriand, or passing the mountains, wandered homeless in the wild. And rumours of the war and the breaking of the siege reached the ear of men in the east of Middle-earth. The sons of Finifin bore most heavily the brunt of the assault, and Angrod and Egnor were slain. So the first great princes of that generation, Arathel has died, but the first of the princes, not the princesses, of that generation are slain in the Dagor Bragollach. Beside them fell Bregalas, lord of the house of Beor, and a great part of the warriors of those people. Men bear the risks with elves. Barahir is further west, his brother, in the pass of Sirion. There Finrod Felagund, hastening from the south, was cut off from his people and surrounded with a small company in the fen of Serek. But Barahir comes up with the bravest of his men and rescues him, and made a wall of spears about him. Then Felagund escaped and returned to Nargothrond, but he swore an oath with Barahir and gives Barahir his ring. This is going to be relevant later in this story, but also it is relevant in The Lord of the Rings, that a promise from the Noldor to aid the House of Beor, in the person of Finrod at least, is made by the Ring of Barahir, which is an heirloom of the kings of Númenor and the kings of Arnor and the chieftains of the Dunedain. Finally, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the Elf of Stone. Barahir returns to Dorthonion. Most of his people flee, and they go to Hithlum, to the west, in Fingon's kingdom now that Fingolfin is dead. Fingon... no, he's not dead yet, sorry, spoiler. But in Fingon's land. And Fingolfin and Fingon can't come to help Finifin. Their own lands, they're driven back to their own fortresses in the mountains. Hador the Golden-Haired, the leader of the Marak, defending the rearguard of his lord, was then 66. He falls, his son Gundor falls, Galdor the Tall takes over, and because of the strength and height of these, they're able to, and the valour of the mountains and the valour of the elves and the men of the north, they hold back the enemy. Hithlum remains unconquered, but Fingolfin was sundered from his kinsmen by a sea of foes. The sons of Feanor suffer as well. The pass of Aglon was forced. Celegorm and Curufin flee south and go all the way to Nargothrond and harbour with Finrod Felagund. Maethros did deeds of surpassing valour. Maethros, remember, is one of the great lords and kings of the Noldor. He is by character, except for the oath of Feanor, he is by his own character and personality worthy of the high kingship that he gives over to Fingolfin. And he holds the hill of Himring, and many of the most valiant that remained, both of the people of Dorthonion and of the East Marches, go there. And he closes for a time the pass of Aglon, which is the western of the passes in that eastern block. The riders of the... But this one thing, that the Noldor are generally, apart from the armies, I guess, from Nargothrond and Gondolin, the armies of the Noldor are mostly horse-borne armies. They are capable in combat, very capable. They are not a match necessarily for the sheer weight of dragons, balrogs, and and orcs, and the other side they come down. The riders of the people of Feanor upon Lothan are destroyed. Glaurung himself destroys them, and they pass over Gelion with fire and terror, coming far into East Beleriand. And Maglor goes to Maethros upon Himring. Caranthir flees and goes south to Amrod and Amras, and they manage to hold in front of Assyriand, where the Green Elves are, and the Green Elves come and help them, which is something you wouldn't necessarily expect. The Green Elves don't take lords anymore since their lord died. They're allies of Thingol, but they managed to hold a flank, really bowed in. So they've kind of, they've been smashed up in the north, and there's pressure in the western passes, and in the east they've been bowed back. They've had to refuse their flank. Fingolfin despairs and goes to fight him, and everyone flees before Morgoth. And everyone flees before him. They think Arome himself has come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. And he challenges Morgoth. He sounds his horn. There is a Chard Roland's The Dark Tower came thing here, isn't there, with the Slughorn. The last time in those wars that Morgoth passed the doors of his stronghold, and he took not the challenge willingly. Though his might was greatest of all things in the world, alone of the Valar he knew fear. But he knows that he has to accept it because his captains see him. And he goes forth in black armour. He stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable emblazoned, cast a shadow over him like storm cloud. But Fingolfin below him gleamed beneath it like a star. For his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil that glittered like ice. And Morgoth has a hammer, the hammer of the underworld, Grond, which you may recall. And Grond, he's smashing, he's trying to, Morgoth is gigantic. There's a good, is it an Alan Lee painting? I think it is. You've got a very good painting of this combat. And Morgoth is trying to hit him, but he wounds Morgoth 7 times. Even though this is a god, Fingolfin, though he's doomed, surely, he's able to stand against him. But Fingolfin grows weary, and Morgoth smashes him with his shield thrice. And thrice again he rose up again and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. He refuses to give up. He falls over eventually in one of the holes from where Grond is. Yet even as Morgoth steps to crush him with his boot, Fingolfin hews his foot with Ringil and cripples him. Morgoth is crippled. His foot is wounded. The blood gushes forth, black and smoking, filling the pits of Grond. Thus died Fingolfin hiking in the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old, more than Finwë and more than Feanor. The orcs made no boast of that duel at the gate, neither did the elves sing of it, for their sorrow is too deep. Yet the tale of it is remembered still, for Thorondor, king of eagles, brought the tidings to Gondolin, and to Hithlum afar off. And Morgoth breaks the body of Fingolfin as to set it to the wolves, and then Thorondor comes hasting from his eyrie among the peaks of the Crissigrim, and stooped upon Morgoth, and mars his face and takes the body for burial. He puts on a mountaintop, and Turgon coming built a high cairn over his father. The role of Thorondor I think is interesting. We've joked about how it's the DM's favourite way of rescuing the PCs when Manwë is DMing the game. But I think there's an interesting thing that it's also Manwë's. It is what Manwë's one cheat. He can't involve himself, but his children, the Great Eagles, can. And Thorondor here is much more active in some ways than Gwaihir is later. Gwaihir is a friend of Gandalf, and they are very vital in particular moments in the War of the Ring, in that period of time and before. But here, instead, we have active combat between the leader, or the equivalent of the high leader of the elves or the dwarves, or not the elves, of the dwarves or the Ents, because they're the same level. They're created by the angels, and it's interesting. Thorondor is very actively involved to salvage the body of Fingolfin, who he believes is obviously a great man who requires good treatment. And no orc ever dares to pass the Mount of Fingolfin until the doom of Gondolin was come, and treachery was born among his kin. We know this is going to be to do with Maeglin at this point. Doom is upon them, and we've been told it. We've already heard of something called the Nerneath Arnodiad, which is yet to come. Fingon becomes High King, but his young son Ereinion, who was after named Gilgalad, he's sent to the Havens. So now we hear that there is a resistance in Dorthonion. Angrod and Egnor are dead, but Barahir refuses to leave. The women are sent away, the children are sent away, but none ever again saw the men that they had left. And the women of the House of Beor marry into the House of Marak in Hithlum. Ryan marries Belagund and Morwen, named Elethwen. Elfsheen marries... not Belagund. Ryan marries... I think Huor, and Morwen marries Hurin. So the remaining men stay behind to fight a guerrilla war until only at last 12 men remain. No one ever sees them again. Barahir, Beren his son, Baragund and Belagund his nephews, the sons of Breglas, and 9 faithful servants of the house whose names were long remembered in the songs of Noldor. Rathreen and Dairian they were, Dagnir and Ragnar, Gildor and Gorlim the unhappy, Arthad and Urthel and Hathaldir the young. Outlaws without hope they became, a desperate band that could not escape and would not yield, for their dwellings were destroyed and their wives and children captured, slain or fled. From Hithlum there came neither news nor help, and Barahir and his men were hunted like wild beasts. And they retreated to the barren highland above the forest, and wandered among the tarns and rocky moors of that region, farthest from the spies and spells of Morgoth. Their bed was the heather, and their roof the cloudy sky. This is, even though they're doomed, this is remembered by the Noldor. This is one of the great stories that men can stand like elves. We've already seen they protected their lords. Both Finrod and Fingolfin have been protected and defended by men, and Finrod gives the ring to Barahir, and now they fight this desperate guerrilla war until only 12 are left, but they refuse to give up their land, and they become, a living nightmare to the evil forces who are trying to occupy this place. For 2 more years after the Dagor Bragollach, the Noldor protect the western pass at Sirion, but eventually Sauron, greatest and most terrible of the servants of Morgoth, who in the Sindarin tongue was named Gorthor, came against Orodreth, the warden of the tower upon Tol Sirion, and he's a sorcerer, Sauron is, and he misshapes what he touches, twists what he rules. He's lord of werewolves. His dominion was torment. He took Minas Tirith, the Tower of Watch, upon Tol Sirion by assault, for a dark cloud of fear that fell upon those that defended it. And Orodreth was driven out and fled to Nargothrond to his brother Finrod. And Sauron turns it from Tol Sirion. It's called Tol in Gaurhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. And Sauron is in control of the western path, and his terror fills the fields and woods of Beleriand. Beyond Hithlum, he pursued his foes relentlessly, and he searched out their hiding places. And they capture Noldor and Sindar, and then we hear this horrendous thing that they're tortured, they're used as slaves to use their craft, particularly Noldor, I imagine, to make weaponry. And occasionally they're released, and sometimes they're released as spies. They've been so broken, they are always bound to Morgoth. And other times they're not. They're not bound to Morgoth, but they're sent out essentially just to torment everyone. They're not traitors, but everyone assumes they are, because they have to assume they are. To men Morgoth feigned pity, if any would hearken to his message, saying, "I'll give you honour. The Noldor have led you to disaster, I'll honour you." But few men of the 3 houses of the Edain gave ear to him, nor even were they brought to the torment of Angband. Not even when they were. They are loyal. Now the swarthy men, occasionally called Easterlings, come over the mountains. These are not the 3 houses of the Edain. These are different. They look different. The other 3 are relatively closely related. I think 2 of the houses are actually quite closely related, even before they cross over the mountains. But these men were short and broad. Their houses were many. Some had greater liking for the dwarves of the mountains than for the elves. But Maethros, knowing the weakness of the Noldor and of the Edain, knows they need friends, and so he gives friendship to the greatest of their chieftains, Bor and Ulfang. Morgoth has designed this. He's really happy about this. That's bad. The sons of Bor were Borlad, Borlach and Borthand, and they followed Maethros and Maglor and cheated the hope of Morgoth and were faithful. The sons of Ulfang the Black were Ulfast and Ulwarth and Uldor the Accursed, and they followed Caranthir and swore allegiance to him and proved faithless. Caranthir has been kind to men before. It's the one time Caranthir is seen as positive. He's not a bad guy completely. and yet it is hard not to think that Maethros and Maglor, arguably the best of the sons of Fëanor, particularly Maethros, they are rewarded with fidelity that cheats the hope of Morgoth, whereas the other men are faithless to Caranthir, often the worst or darkest of the sons of Fëanor. The Edain and the Easterlings don't like each other. The Easterlings are in East Beleriand. Beor's house has been destroyed. Hador's house is in Hithlum, and the people of Haleth, at first untouched, in the forest of Brethil. But the Orcs eventually arrive, and amid the tale of defeats of that time, the deeds of the Haladin are remembered. For after the taking of Minas Tirith, the Orcs came through the western pass and maybe would have ravaged even to the mouths of Sirion. They would have gone unhindered down past Nargothrond, forcing the armies in and down. But Halmir, Lord of the Haladin, got the sent word to Thingol, and Thingol intervenes. Beleg Strongbow, the chief of the March Wardens of Doriath, we've heard him, brings forth great strength from the Sindar armed with axes, and they destroy an Orc legion. And therefore, after the black tide of the north was stemmed in that region, the Orcs dared not cross the Maeglin for many years after. So, though there is the salient, in military terms, next to Doriath and the Maeglin, between Doriath and the Maeglin, they can't go south from there. And the people of Haleth dwelt yet in watchful peace in the forest of Brethil. Behind their guard, the kingdom of Nargothrond had respite and mustered its strength. And Hurin and Huor now marry, we're told. The houses all joined here, because the house of Beor and the house of Marek have married, and now the the house of Haleth and the house of Beor, is it marry? And then the house of Marek? I'm trying to remember that. Basically, they all get married in together. I think first the Haleth into the house of Marek, and then the house of Beor, and then the house of Beor into the house of Marek is the way it goes. Sorry if that's confusing. And Hurin and Huor are fostered in Brethil by their uncle Haldir, and they take part in these wars. And they would have been taken or slain in these wars, except Ulmo rescues them and takes them to the Chrysigrim, and Thorondir rescues them and takes them to Gondolin. So now we have the next step of the story of Gondolin as well, but also the story of Huor and Hurin and their children. And Turgon welcomes them well. He really likes them. He took great liking for the sons of Galdor. But eventually, Hurin and Huor want to go home. We are but mortal men. We're going to die here. Maeglin's sister son is jealous and angry. He grieves not for their going, though he begrudged them the favour. He said to Hurin, "The king's grace is greater than you know, and the law has become less stern than aforetime, or else no choice would be given you but to abide here to your life's end." Hurin says, the king's grace is greater, and we will swear oaths to you, and they swear to Maeglin never to reveal the counsels of Turgon. Maeglin is perhaps not bitter about his father's death, but he remembers it, and he sees particularly these men who are so loved by his adoptive father, his uncle Turgon. He sees this as a cause of jealousy, and he's very frustrated by the fact they have privileges he feels he hasn't. He's a bitter man. He's embittered even unjustly, and they're allowed to leave because they didn't know the way in. So they are taken out by Eagle and blindfolded. Or are they? Is it Eagle or are they blindfolded? And the Eagles take them away by night, so they don't know the way back in. And then the house of Marek, Galdor, is like, their father is like, "Where were you?" But they refuse to tell, and people begin to guess. And Morgoth hears that maybe here is the secret of Gondolin. He doesn't know where Turgon is. Now, Turgon does not stay hidden completely. He sends a group of his people to the havens, and he builds ships. And Turgon knows that they can't win. Turgon and Finrod are not stupid. They're not like, "Oh, well, we'll just make fortresses that save the day." They try to get help from the west in Turgon's case. They try to get to the west, but they're enchanted, or they get lost, or they return. And many were lost, few returned. The doom of Gondolin grows nearer. He knows he can't beat Morgoth. At this point, Fingolfin, his father, has fallen in battle. Fëanor, similarly, couldn't, though it wasn't against Morgoth himself, couldn't defeat them. Turgon knows the best hopes of the Noldor lie in the gods who wait in the west. Morgoth really wants to know, though, where Felagund and Turgon are. He knows Finrod exists, and he goes to war, but he doesn't know the secret of Nargothrond. He neither knows its place nor its strength. He knows the name. He knows nothing of Gondolin. And he sends armies forth to find out, but his armies are defeated, and in the south there is a semblance of peace again for a few brief years. But the forges of Angband were full of labour. And Galdor the Tall holds Aethel Sirion on the mountains, the arid Wethrin, and Hurin, his son, was newly come to manhood, great in strength, and he drove the orcs with great slaughter back. But Fingon is hard put to help, and this new army that's coming in the minor battle, much like the earlier minor battles we've seen, comes down to Hithlum. But now Círdan comes from the Havens to help. And the orcs break and flee, and their horsed archers again, this idea of the Noldor as horse archers chiefly, pursue them even into the Iron Mountains. So you have kind of post-battles, at first Tol Sirion and the battles around Brethil, and then Aethel Sirion later. And these minor battles, along with what's happened at the siege at Himring and the holding of the line north of Assyriand, Morgoth is defeated. He overextends his strength, and in many of those cases, including in the east, men, because Maethros takes the help of men, help aid the elves in their battles. And the Grey Elves here, both at Brethil, where they come to the aid of men under Beleg, and here in Hithlum, come there. And so, even with these breaches in relationship, the collapsing alliances, the increasing bitterness, and it's only going to get much worse, they are not yet fully sundered, and they will never be fully sundered, in fact. But there is briefly a peace. And there is a thing here that in terms of preciousness, Tolkien values small good things, even though they are limited. And so we're not to see that as, oh, well, they don't know how bad they have it, they're all about to die. But rather, it is good that for a time, Irani and Gil-galad could grow up in peace at the Havens rather than at war. It's good for a time that in Hithlum, the House of Hurin, the House of Galdor and the House of Marak could ally, and then these great wonderful marriages would happen. We do hear at the end, though, that Hurin rules Aethel Sirion in Dor-lomin, and he is mighty. He's of less stature than his fathers, but he's tireless and enduring in body. He was swift after the manner of his mother's kin, Haleth of the Haladin. And this is wonderful, but we do hear his wife is Morwen, who fled from Dorthonion with Ryan, daughter of Belagund, and Emeldir, the mother of Beren. Beren has stayed behind. Barahir and Beren have stayed behind. In this time also, the outlaws of Dorthonion were destroyed, as is told hereafter, and Beren, son of Barahir, alone escaping, came hardily into Doriath. In chapter 19 of Beren and Luthien, one of the great tales of the Silmarillion. So though even there we hear yet another disaster has struck, but nonetheless something interesting is about to happen. That's been very long, but then this is perhaps the fullest section we've ever had or will have. Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you next time.